I was 23 when I learned that Salvation could wear a three-piece suit and carry a gun. The basement door exploded inward, not kicked, demolished, and through the splinters and dust stood Dante Moretti, Boston's most feared name, backlit like some avenging angel pulled straight from a nightmare. His eyes found mine in the darkness, and for one suspended heartbeat, I saw something crack behind that marble exterior. Then he saw the chains, the blood, the tally marks I'd carved into the concrete counting days I'd been buried alive. "Who did this?" he demanded, voice lethal and soft. I opened my mouth to answer, but he was already staring at the monogrammed cufflink near my mattress, the one that matched the set he'd given his father last Christmas. You will feel so many emotions in this mysterious love story I'm about to tell. Please support us by clicking subscribe to the channel. I thought I understood the mathematics of survival by the time I turned 23. Keep your head down, don't make eye contact. Exist in the margins of other people's stories, never the center of your own. At Lucia's Diner in South Boston, I'd perfected the art of being forgettable. The waitress who refilled coffee without conversation, who knew every regular's order but never their secrets, who clocked out precisely at midnight and walked the 6 blocks home without once looking up at the stars. The neighborhood belonged to the Morettis. Everyone knew that the way you know gravity exists, undeniable, invisible, the force that shapes everything without ever needing to announce itself. Their name was written in the architecture of our streets, the businesses that never closed, the cops who looked the other way, the sudden gentrification of buildings that had been condemned for decades. But if you were smart, if you stayed quiet and didn't ask questions about the men in expensive suits who conducted meetings in corner booths at 3 a.m. You could carve out a small, safe existence in the spaces between their power. That illusion lasted exactly 8 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. It shattered on a Thursday night when Dante Moretti himself walked through our door at 2 a.m., and I learned that some people carry violence in their bones the way others carry music. The diner was nearly empty. Just old Joe nursing his 10th cup of decaf at the counter and a couple of college kids pretending to study while they sobered up enough to drive home. Maya was supposed to work the floor, but she'd disappeared into the bathroom 20 minutes earlier with her phone and that desperate look that meant her boyfriend was texting again. So I was alone when the door opened and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He was bleeding. Bleeding. That's what I noticed first. Not the Armani suit that probably cost more than my annual rent. Not the way every head in the diner turned and then quickly looked away. Not the dangerous elegance in the way he moved. Just the blood. A thin crimson line tracing down his jaw from a cut near his temple, dripping onto the collar of his white shirt like punctuation marks. My nursing school instincts overrode every self-preservation protocol I'd spent years building. I grabbed the first aid kit from behind the counter, the good one we kept for kitchen accidents, not the Band-Aids and antiseptic wipes kit we showed health inspectors, and approached his booth without asking permission. "You're dripping on the vinyl." The words left my mouth before my brain could approve them. His head turned slowly, and I found myself looking into eyes the color of a winter sky, gray and depthless and completely unreadable. The silence that followed felt alive, predatory, like something with teeth. I should have walked away, should have let him bleed into the cheap upholstery and returned to refilling napkin dispensers, to my careful choreography of invisibility. Instead, I slid into the booth across from him, opened the kit, and met his stare with something that might have been courage, or might have been exhaustion so profound it looked the same. I didn't ask for help. His voice was smooth as expensive whiskey, and just as likely to burn going down. "No, but you need it anyway." I dampened a gauze pad with antiseptic, reached across the table. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched me with that same unsettling intensity, like he was cataloging every detail of my face, filing away vulnerabilities for future use. When I pressed the gauze to his temple, his hand came up fast, not violent, just sudden, and caught my wrist. His grip was controlled or exactly the kind of restraint that suggested he knew precisely how much pressure it would take to break bone. "What's your name?" "Elena. Elena Cross." Elena. The way he said it made my name sound like a decision he was making, something he was choosing to remember. His thumb pressed against my pulse point, and I knew he could feel my heart racing, knew he understood exactly how afraid I was beneath the steady hands and the calm voice. "I'm Dante. And you should be more careful about who you decide to help, Elena Cross." He released my wrist. "Let me finish cleaning the wound." The cut wasn't deep, would probably scar, but wouldn't need stitches. I worked in silence, hyper-aware of the weight of his attention. The way old Joe had suddenly decided his coffee was fascinating. The way the college kids had packed up and left without finishing their fries. When I was done, I sealed the butterfly bandage and started to slide out of the booth. His phone buzzed then, just once. But the change in his expression was seismic, from curious to arctic in the space between heartbeats. He pulled the phone from his jacket, read whatever message had appeared on the screen, and his jaw tightened in a way that made me think of doors locking, of irreversible decisions. When do you work next? Tomorrow night. 10 to close. He stood, placed a $100 bill on the table for a cup of coffee he hadn't ordered. Then he looked down at me with something in his eyes that might have been concern or might have been calculation, and delivered words that felt like chains disguised as protection. No. From now on, you work day shift only. No nights. That's not a request. That's not a suggestion either. He walked out before I could argue, before I could explain that I needed the night differential, that my mother's medical bills didn't care about my safety, that he had no right to rearrange my life like he was moving furniture. The door closed behind him with a small bell chime that sounded obscene in the sudden silence. Maya emerged from the bathroom, then mascara smudged, phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline. She took one look at my face, at the $100 bill on the table, at the space where Dante Moretti had been sitting, and her eyes went wide. Elena, tell me you didn't just... I gave him first aid. That's all. That's never all. Not with them. She was right, of course. I knew it then. Sitting in that booth with antiseptic still stinging my fingers, with the weight of his attention still pressed against my skin like a brand, something had begun that I didn't understand, something that felt inevitable and dangerous and already too late to stop. I found out the next morning that my schedule had been adjusted. My manager, Terry, who'd worked for Lucia's for 30 years and knew exactly which battles to fight, handed me the new roster with an apologetic shrug. Request came from ownership. You're on days now. Permanent. Terry, I can't afford. Pay stays the same. Night differential included. Of course it did. Because Dante Moretti didn't make suggestions or requests. He simply rearranged the world to match his expectations, and the rest of us adapted or got crushed trying to resist. I should have been grateful. Should have recognized protection when it wore an expensive suit and came with financial compensation. Instead, I felt trapped, observed, chosen for something I couldn't name and didn't want. That feeling crystallized 3 days later when I walked to my car after my first day shift ended at 6. A black Mercedes was idling in the parking lot, engine purring, windows tinted so dark they looked like negative space cut from reality. The driver's window descended smoothly, revealing a man in his 50s with silver temples and dead eyes. Miss Cross. Mr. Moretti requests you get in the car. I have my own ride. That wasn't a request either. I got in the car. Not because I was brave, but because I'd learned a long time ago that resistance only works when you have leverage. And girls like me, with hospital bills stacked like accusation letters on our kitchen counters, and mothers whose medication costs more than rent, we don't get the luxury of leverage. We get survival. We get careful calculations about which battles might actually be winnable. The driver didn't speak during the 20-minute ride through streets that got progressively cleaner, progressively older, progressively more expensive. South Boston became Beacon Hill. Chain link fences became wrought iron. My world became someone else's postcard. When we finally stopped in front of a Gothic mansion that looked like it had been airlifted from a European ghost story, I understood with perfect clarity that I'd crossed into territory where my mathematics of survival no longer applied. Dante met me at the door himself. No butler, no intermediary, just him in shirt sleeves and dark slacks, looking somehow more dangerous without the armor of his suit jacket. His temple still bore the butterfly bandage I'd applied, a small proof that I'd touched him, that the interaction in the diner had been real and not some fever dream conjured by exhaustion. You could have called, you would have said no. He wasn't wrong. I would have said no to whatever this was, would have built walls out of pride and self-preservation, and the stubborn belief that I could keep existing in the margins if I just tried hard enough. He stepped aside, gestured for me to enter, and I walked into a foyer that smelled like old money and older secrets, polished wood and leather-bound books, and something underneath that might have been fear or might have been blood, impossible to distinguish. My father needs a nurse. He said it like he was discussing the weather, leading me through hallways lined with oil paintings of stern-faced men who all shared his cheekbones, his calculating eyes. I'm not a nurse. I'm 2 semesters away from... You're more qualified than anyone else he'll tolerate, and the pay is triple what you're making at Lucia's. Live-in position. Private room, meals included, full access to medical supplies. He stopped in front of a closed door, turned to face me with an expression I couldn't read. He's recovering from a stroke, 74 years old. He can be demanding, particular about his routines, but he's harmless now. The doctors say another 6 months of intensive care and he'll be functional enough to manage on his own. Harmless. The word felt wrong in a house like this, in a neighborhood that whispered the Moretti name with a mixture of reverence and terror. But Dante was looking at me with something in his eyes that almost resembled pleading, and I thought about my mother's latest hospital bill. Final notice stamped in red across the top like a threat, and I heard myself say yes before my brain could mount an adequate defense. When would I start? Tonight? If you agree, I need to get my things. Already arranged. Your apartment's been packed. Your mother's care transferred to a better facility. Cambridge Memorial. Private room, specialist on staff. The words should have sounded generous. Instead, they felt like walls closing in, like every choice I might have made had already been decided by someone who moved through the world rearranging lives the way other people rearranged furniture. You can't just... I can. I did. You can walk away right now, Elena. Go back to the diner, back to your life. But your mother's transfer is already complete, and Cambridge Memorial doesn't accept Medicaid. So you'd need to transfer her back, which would take weeks of paperwork and leave her in limbo without adequate care. Or you can take this job, make enough money to actually cover her expenses, and give her the treatment she deserves. It wasn't a choice. It was a trap wrapped in silk, baited with the only thing I couldn't refuse, my mother's survival. He knew it. I knew it. The air between us hummed with that shared understanding, with my resentment and his clinical efficiency and something else, something that felt like guilt flickering behind his careful composure. I hate you a little bit right now. I know. That's fair. He opened the door, revealed a bedroom suite larger than my entire apartment, 4-poster bed, ensuite bathroom, windows overlooking a garden where roses bloomed despite the October chill. My belongings were already arranged with careful precision. My books on the shelf, my clothes in the closet, my mother's photograph on the nightstand in its cheap drugstore frame, looking absurdly out of place among all this calculated elegance. You'll meet my father tomorrow. Tonight. Just settle in. There's a phone on the desk. Direct line to my cell if you need anything. He started to leave, then paused in the doorway, backlit like he'd been that first night in the diner, all sharp edges and shadow. Thank you, Elena, for doing this. I didn't have a choice. I know. But I'm grateful anyway. After he left, I sat on the edge of the bed, mattress so soft it felt like drowning, and tried to remember the last time I'd made a decision that was actually mine. The diner had been necessity. Dropping out of nursing school had been necessity. This was necessity too, just dressed up in Egyptian cotton sheets and the promise of financial stability. I met Vincent Moretti the next morning over breakfast that felt more like an audition. He was smaller than I'd expected, diminished by illness but not destroyed by it. White hair combed back with precision, pale blue eyes that tracked my movements with an attention that made my skin prickle. When he smiled, it reached his eyes but didn't warm them. Dante tells me you're remarkable, that you approached him without fear. I approached someone who was bleeding. I didn't know who he was. Even better, competence without calculation. So rare. He reached across the table, patted my hand with fingers that trembled slightly. The stroke's residual damage, I assumed. But his grip lingered a beat too long, his thumb pressing against my knuckles in a gesture that felt possessive rather than paternal. You'll take good care of me, won't you, Elena? That's what I'm here for, Mr. Moretti. Vincent. Call me Vincent. We're going to be very close, you and I. The days blurred into routine. I administered medications, monitored vitals, helped Vincent with physical therapy exercises designed to restore his mobility. He was charming when he wanted to be, telling stories about old Boston, about building an empire from a fruit cart in the North End, about his late wife who died when Dante was 12. But there were moments when something else showed through the grandfather facade. The way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his compliments felt barbed, designed to test rather than praise. The way he asked questions about my mother, my past, my vulnerabilities, cataloging weaknesses like he was building a file. The house was never empty. Men in expensive suits drifted through like well-dressed ghosts. Meetings in the study, conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, glances that assessed and dismissed me in the same breath. Dante was rarely there, always working, always somewhere else. When our paths did cross, usually late at night when I was checking Vincent's vitals before bed, we spoke in careful pleasantries that felt like lies of omission. Is he treating you well? He's fine. Demanding, but fine. If he makes you uncomfortable, I can handle it. I could handle it. That's what I told myself through Vincent's 2 long touches, through the way he'd ask me to stay and talk after I'd finished my evening rounds, through the growing feeling that I was being studied, shaped, prepared for something I couldn't name. On my 5th night, I found the envelope slipped under my bedroom door. Heavy paper, expensive stock, my name written in elegant script across the front. Inside, a single photograph. Me, leaving Lucia's diner on what must have been my last shift, circled in red ink like a target. And underneath, 3 words that turned my blood to ice. You were chosen specifically. I didn't sleep that night. Just sat on the edge of my too-soft bed, staring at the photograph, trying to understand what it meant. Chosen for what? By whom? Vincent's charming facade suddenly felt sinister. Every kind word a manipulation, every touch a test. And Dante, where was Dante in all of this? Had he known? Was he complicit? Or was I caught between 2 Morettis playing games I didn't understand with stakes I couldn't calculate? At 3 a.m., I finally opened my door, intending to find Dante, to demand answers, to maybe just run. But Vincent was standing in the hallway, looking more vital than he'd appeared in any of our sessions. No tremor in his hands, no weakness in his posture. He smiled when he saw me, that same warm expression that didn't reach his eyes. Couldn't sleep, dear? Sometimes this old house makes noises that can be unsettling. Why don't I make us some tea? He knew. Somehow, he knew I'd found the envelope, and this solicitous grandfather act, was his way of telling me that running wouldn't matter, that resistance wouldn't matter, that I was exactly where he wanted me to be. I smiled back, matching his performance with one of my own, and followed him downstairs, the photograph burning in my pocket like evidence of a crime I hadn't yet committed, but was somehow already guilty of. I tried to leave on the 6th night. Not dramatically. I've never been the type to slam doors or make speeches about dignity and autonomy. I just packed my single duffel bag with the few things that actually mattered, left a note thanking Vincent for the opportunity, and slipped out through the kitchen entrance at 2 a.m. when I knew the house was at its quietest, when even the ghosts in expensive suits had gone home to whatever lives they pretended to lead. The garden gate should have been my threshold back into ordinary existence. 5 steps, and I'd be on the sidewalk. 10 more, and I'd reach the corner where I could catch a cab. I'd mapped it in my head a dozen times, rehearsed the script I'd use when I called my mother to explain why we were going back to Cambridge General, back to the world where we counted pills and rationed hope. I made it 4 steps before the men materialized from the shadows. Not Moretti security. I'd learned to recognize them over the past week. The way they carried themselves with that particular blend of vigilance and boredom that comes from guarding something you believe is invincible. These men were different. Leaner, hungrier. The kind of dangerous that didn't come with a salary and benefits, that came from necessity and the absence of other options. Elena Cross. The taller one said my name like he was checking items off a grocery list. He knew my mother's hospital, Cambridge Memorial, room 447. He knew my route to nursing school before I'd dropped out, the 47 bus to the Green Line, transferring at Park Street. He knew things I'd never told anyone in this house, details that suggested surveillance far more comprehensive than a single photograph slipped under a door. Vincent sends his regards. The shorter one smiled when he said it, and I understood with perfect clarity that whatever Vincent had been preparing me for, this was the opening act, the test, the moment when I'd either break or prove myself worth whatever investment he'd made. My hand found my phone in my jacket pocket. Dead battery, of course. I'd been so focused on leaving quietly that I'd forgotten to charge it, forgotten that survival requires preparation, not just courage. The taller man noticed the gesture, laughed softly. No one's coming for you. You're not that important yet. Yet. The word hung in the October air like a promise and a threat, like the space between what I was and what Vincent intended to make me. I opened my mouth to scream, to fight, to do something other than stand there frozen like prey, hypnotized by predators. Headlights cut through the darkness. A Maserati took the corner too fast, tires screaming, and skidded to a stop between me and the men with a precision that suggested the driver had done this before, had calculated exactly how much space he needed to become a barrier. The door opened and Dante emerged, and I finally understood why people whispered his name with that particular mixture of fear and respect. He moved like violence was a language he'd spoken since childhood. No wasted motion, no hesitation, just brutal efficiency that turned two armed men into unconscious bodies on the cobblestones in under 90 seconds. I didn't see all of it. My brain kept trying to edit out the worst parts. The sounds of impact, the way bone breaks differently than other things. When it was over, Dante was breathing hard but standing, and the men who'd known my mother's room number were bleeding onto Vincent's carefully maintained garden path. He didn't ask if I was okay, didn't touch me to check for injuries or offer comfort. He just gripped my shoulders with hands that were still forming bruises and looked at me with eyes that were equal parts fury and something that looked disturbingly like fear. Get in the car. Now. Dante, I can't. Get in the fucking car, Elena. I'd never heard him curse before. Never heard his control slip enough to reveal what lived underneath all that careful composure. It scared me more than the men on the ground. More than the photograph. More than any of this. Because Dante Moretti losing control meant the situation was worse than I'd understood. Meant the mathematics of survival had variables I hadn't accounted for. I got in the car. He drove in silence through streets I didn't recognize, taking turns that felt random but probably weren't, checking the rearview mirror with a frequency that suggested we might be followed. My hands were shaking. Delayed reaction. Adrenaline crash. The body's way of processing terror after the moment has passed. I pressed them between my knees and tried to remember how to breathe like a normal person, instead of someone who'd just watched two men get dismantled with surgical precision. Where are we going? Somewhere we can talk. Somewhere he doesn't own. Somewhere Vincent doesn't own. The phrase suggested that most places fell into the opposite category, that Boston itself might be just another room in his house, another space where his will shaped reality. We ended up in Southie, in a warehouse that smelled like motor oil and old coffee, all exposed brick and harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look like a crime scene even when it wasn't. The space was filled with cork boards covered in photographs, maps with colored pins, strings connecting faces to locations to bank account numbers, the kind of conspiracy theory setup that would look insane if it wasn't so meticulously organized. Dante locked the door behind us, engaged 3 separate deadbolts, then turned to face me with an expression I couldn't parse. Not anger anymore, something worse, something that looked like guilt. How much do you know about my father? He's recovering from a stroke. He's charming. He asks too many questions and his hands linger too long, and I'm pretty sure he's testing me for something, but I don't know what. He's been running a trafficking operation for 40 years. The words should have shocked me. Should have felt impossible. Too large to fit inside the frame of the frail old man who'd asked me to call him Vincent, who'd told stories about his late wife with tears in his pale eyes. But something in me had known, had recognized the predator underneath the performance, had felt the wrongness even when I couldn't name it. Dante moved to the largest corkboard, gestured at the web of evidence with a hand that still bore scraped knuckles from the garden. Nurses. Caregivers. Women in vulnerable positions. He identifies targets, usually someone with debt, family obligations, something that makes them desperate enough to take jobs they'd otherwise refuse. Then he studies them, tests them, breaks them down until they're either compliant or destroyed. He pulled a file from a stack on the table, handed it to me with steady hands that betrayed nothing. Inside, a profile that could have been written about me. Financial situation, desperate. Family vulnerabilities, mother with chronic illness. Education, incomplete. Psychological assessment, proud, stubborn, likely to resist initially, but responds to threats against loved ones. You fit his profile perfectly. Isolated, desperate, proud enough not to ask questions until it's too late. My vision blurred at the edges. Not tears, something worse than tears. Something that felt like my entire understanding of reality fracturing along fault lines I hadn't known existed. The stroke. Was that even real? Real enough, but not debilitating. He could have managed with outpatient care. Hiring you was theater. A test. For what? Dante's jaw tightened, and I saw the answer before he said it. Saw it in the guilt that had been haunting his eyes since that first night at the diner. For me. To see if I'd protect you, or let him have you. The warehouse felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in, my lungs unable to find enough oxygen in the stale air. I sat down hard on a metal folding chair, the file still clutched in my hands, looking at my life reduced to data points and psychological weaknesses. Why me specifically? There are thousands of women in Boston who fit this profile. Because you reminded him of someone, and because he knew it would destroy me to watch. Dante crossed to another board, this one covered in older photographs, women's faces spanning decades, each marked with dates and outcomes. Some had relocated written across them. Others had locations. A few just had red X's. I've been documenting his operation for 10 years, building a case against him, against the organization. But I needed time, needed to control enough of the business to protect the women I could save, to create exit strategies, to build something strong enough to withstand the war that's coming when I finally move against him. He pulled another folder, but this time he hesitated before opening it, his fingers white-knuckled against the manila. 3 months ago, he told me about you, showed me your photograph, said he'd found the perfect candidate for his next project, asked if I wanted to be involved. It was a test, to see if I'd become him, if 10 years of learning his business had corrupted me enough to participate. When I refused, he hired you anyway, put you in his house, made sure I knew exactly what he was doing. So you what? Decided to save me? Is that what the job offer was? The schedule change? Your version of protection? Yes. At least he was honest. At least he didn't try to dress it up as anything other than what it was. Another man making decisions about my life, rearranging my existence to fit his narrative, the hero to his father's villain, but still playing the same fundamental game of control. I should have told you from the beginning, should have given you the choice. But I thought, his phone buzzed, once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession, each vibration seeming to drain more color from his face. He pulled it out, read the screen, and the transformation was immediate. Every muscle tensing, every calculated breath becoming something jagged. He turned the phone so I could see. A photograph of my mother's hospital room, taken from inside, the angle suggesting someone had been standing right beside her bed. The timestamp read 47 minutes ago. She was sleeping, vulnerable and unaware, and someone had been close enough to touch her, close enough to do anything. The caption appeared in a separate message. She looks peaceful when she sleeps. My hands stopped shaking. Something in me went very still, very cold, the fear crystallizing into something harder, something that felt like rage mixed with calculation. We're going to get her. Right now. Elena. Right now, Dante. Or I walk out of here and you never see me again. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Or respect. The acknowledgement that I'd just stopped being someone who needed saving and become someone who needed arming. Okay. But after we move her, after we make sure she's safe, you're going to have to decide. Stay and help me destroy him, or disappear and spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. That's not a choice. No. But it's the truth. We left the warehouse together, allies now instead of victim and savior, and I understood that every door I'd walked through in the past week had been leading to this moment. Not the rescue, but the decision to stop running and start fighting back. We moved my mother at 3 a.m., when Cambridge Memorial was at its quietest, when the night shift nurses were focused on their rounds and paperwork instead of scrutinizing visitor logs. Dante had made calls during the drive, clipped, efficient conversations in a voice I was learning to recognize as his command mode, the tone that expected compliance and usually got it. By the time we arrived, there was a private ambulance waiting at the service entrance and a discharge order signed by a doctor whose name I didn't recognize, but who apparently owed the Moretti family favors that extended to forging medical records. My mother woke confused, groggy from the sedatives they'd given her for pain management. Her eyes found mine in the dim room, and I watched her try to process the scene. The strangers in paramedic uniforms, the man in the expensive suit standing guard by the door, her daughter's face wearing an expression she'd probably never seen before, something harder than fear, sharper than desperation. Elena? Baby, what's happening? We're moving you somewhere safer, Mom. Somewhere better. I held her hand during the transfer, manufacturing calm I didn't feel, answering her questions with half-truths and gentle lies. Yes, the new facility was covered by insurance. No, she didn't need to worry about costs. Yes, I'd be able to visit just as often. The ambulance took us north to a private medical center in Lexington, the kind of place where politicians and CEOs went for treatment, where discretion was as much a service as healthcare, where the security guards were former military and the perimeter was monitored by cameras that actually worked. Dante had arranged a suite on the 4th floor with windows overlooking gardens that probably cost more to maintain than most people's mortgages. Private nurses rotating in 8-hour shifts. Specialists on call. Every medication she needed and several she didn't know existed. Newer treatments her previous insurance had classified as experimental and therefore not covered. "This is too much," I whispered to him while my mother was being settled into her new room by a nurse whose competence radiated from her like light. "I can't possibly pay for this." "You're not paying. I am. Consider it an investment in making sure you don't run again." "That's not." "It's protection, Elena. For her and for you. The people who sent those men tonight. They know every vulnerability you have. Your mother's safety is leverage, and I just removed it from the equation." He was right, and I hated that he was right. Hated that safety had to be purchased with obligation, that every door he opened came with locks I couldn't see but could feel closing around me. When my mother was finally asleep, real sleep, not the fitful drowsing that passed for rest at Cambridge Memorial, Dante led me to a consultation room down the hall. Leather chairs, abstract art on the walls, the kind of space designed to deliver bad news in comfortable surroundings. He poured himself water from a glass pitcher, offered me one, waited until I'd taken several sips before speaking. "I need you to understand what you're walking into. If you stay, if you help me take down my father's operation, there's no going back to your old life. You'll be a witness, a target. Every person he's ever hurt, every deal he's ever made, every crime that gets exposed, you'll be connected to all of it. And if I don't help, then I give you a new identity, money, relocation assistance. You and your mother disappear. Somewhere he'll never find you. Montana, Oregon. Somewhere you can start over. I should have taken it. Should have chosen safety over vengeance, anonymity over justice. That's what the old Elena would have done. The girl who kept her head down and made herself small, who survived by not mattering to anyone powerful enough to hurt her. But that girl had died somewhere between the garden gate and the warehouse full of evidence, between seeing my mother's sleeping face photographed by strangers and understanding that running would only mean spending the rest of my life waiting for Vincent Moretti's next move. "What do you need from me?" Something flickered in Dante's expression. Relief, maybe? Or recognition? The acknowledgement that I'd just chosen the harder path and he was grateful I had. Information. Everything you observed in his house. Every conversation, every visitor, every moment that felt wrong. Your testimony is clean. You're not part of the organization, not complicit in his crimes. When this goes to trial, a witness like you is invaluable. When this goes to trial, you're that confident? I'm that committed. I've spent 10 years building this case, Elena. I won't stop now. We went to his apartment after that. A penthouse in the financial district that matched everything I'd learned about Dante Moretti. All clean lines and expensive minimalism. The kind of space that suggested its occupant didn't spend much time there, didn't believe in the luxury of comfort. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. Boston spread out below us like a constellation of possibilities and failures. Every light representing someone's life intersecting with someone else's. The beautiful, terrible mathematics of proximity. He made coffee in a kitchen that looked unused. Expensive Italian espresso machine that probably cost more than my car. We sat at a glass dining table that could have seated 12, and I realized with sudden clarity that Dante Moretti was probably the loneliest person I'd ever met. Surrounded by power and money and people who obeyed his commands, but fundamentally isolated in a way that had nothing to do with physical space and everything to do with the weight of secrets he carried. 3 rules, he said, setting down his cup with careful precision. 1. You don't leave this apartment without security. I have people I trust, former military, people who've proven their loyalty. They'll accompany you everywhere. I'm not a prisoner. No, you're a target. There's a difference. Fine. What's rule 2? You don't contact anyone from your old life. Friends from the diner, former classmates, anyone who knew you before. Anyone you reach out to becomes a vulnerability, a way to find you. The rule hurt more than I'd expected. Maya's face flashed through my mind. My almost friend from Lucia's, the one who'd warned me about getting noticed by men like Dante. I wondered if she'd already heard I'd disappeared, if she was worried or just grateful it hadn't been her who'd caught his attention. And 3, you tell me everything. Every weird moment with my father, every conversation, every time something felt off, the smallest details matter. His patterns, his routines, the way he tests people. I need to know what he showed you because it tells me what he's planning. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, feeling the heat seep into my palms, grounding myself in the physical sensation because everything else felt too large, too complex, too much like drowning in someone else's war. And what's my rule? He looked up, surprised. Your rule? You gave me 3, I get 1. That's how negotiations work, right? A ghost of a smile touched his mouth, the first time I'd seen anything close to amusement since the garden. Okay. What's your rule? Truth. Always. No more protecting me from information I deserve to have. No more deciding what I can handle. If I'm in this, I'm all the way in. That means you treat me like an ally, not a victim you're managing. The silence stretched between us, full of assessment and recalibration. I watched him weigh my demand against his instincts, the part of him that had spent a decade learning how to control situations, how to manipulate outcomes, warring with something else, something that recognized I was offering him partnership instead of compliance. Deal. He extended his hand across the table, formal and oddly touching, like we were signing contracts instead of agreeing to destroy his father together. I shook it, his grip firm and warm, and felt the shift in dynamics. No longer protector and protected, but something more complicated, more equal. Then I need you to tell me everything, starting with why your father chose me specifically. You said I reminded him of someone. Dante stood, moved to the windows, staring out at the city with his back to me. When he spoke, his voice carried weight I hadn't heard before. Grief underneath the control, loss underneath the calculation. My mother, you have the same coloring she did. Dark hair, green eyes, that particular way you hold yourself like you're trying to take up less space than you deserve. He noticed it the first time he saw your photograph. Mentioned it like it was a gift he was giving himself. The chance to reenact something from his past. What happened to her? Officially? Aneurysm. She collapsed in the garden, died before the ambulance arrived. I was 12, but I'm not convinced it was natural. There were inconsistencies, questions no one wanted to ask. He turned back to face me, and I saw past the marble exterior to the boy who'd lost his mother and spent the next 20 years learning to become powerful enough that no one could take anything from him again. He tested her too. Made her prove her loyalty in increasingly impossible ways. By the end, she barely recognized herself. I think she was planning to leave him, to take me with her. And then she was just gone. I'm sorry. Don't be. Use it. Every time you doubt whether this is worth it, whether we should just run and let him win, remember that he doesn't stop. He doesn't let people go. He owns or he destroys. And there's no middle ground. Dawn was starting to paint the windows gold when Dante finally showed me to the guest room. Another space that felt unlived in, all neutral colors and hotel-quality linens. I should have been exhausted, but my mind was racing, processing everything I'd learned, everything I'd agreed to, the weight of becoming someone who mattered enough to be targeted. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard my phone buzz. I'd plugged it in to charge when we'd arrived, turned it off to avoid whatever messages might be accumulating from people wondering where I'd disappeared to. But someone had turned it back on. Someone who had access to this apartment, who knew which room I was in. The message was from an unknown number, a video file, downloading automatically despite my security settings. I should have deleted it, should have shown it to Dante immediately. Instead, I pressed play with hands that had started shaking again. The footage was from the estate's basement, recent, judging by the lighting, the pristine condition. It showed a steel door I'd never seen during my time there, reinforced and industrial, completely at odds with the mansion's aesthetic. The camera zoomed in on the lock, on fresh scratches around the mechanism suggesting recent use, recent force. Then the video cut to text. Blood-red letters against black. Ready for the next delivery. Elijah Carver, arriving Monday. A name I didn't recognize. A person I'd never met. Someone's son or brother or father. Someone with a life that was about to intersect with Vincent Moretti's carefully constructed hell. And I had 72 hours to figure out how to stop it. I sat up, gripping my phone, staring at the message that felt like both a warning and a taunt. Vincent knew I'd left. Knew I was with Dante. And he was telling us exactly what he planned to do next, daring us to try stopping him, confident that even with all our evidence and preparation, we'd fail the way everyone else had failed for 40 years. I found Dante in his study, still awake, surrounded by files and photographs and the architecture of his father's empire. I handed him my phone without speaking, watched his expression freeze as he absorbed the implications. Monday. That's 3 days. I know. We're not ready. The case isn't complete. Moving now means risking everything. I thought about Elijah Carver, whoever he was, whatever circumstances had made him Vincent's next target. I thought about my mother, about all the women in those photographs, about the girl Dante had saved when he was barely old enough to drive. Then we get ready. But we don't let him take another person, not while we can stop it. Dante looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the decision crystallize behind his eyes. The choice to act now instead of waiting for perfect conditions, to risk everything for one person because that's what separated us from his father. The ability to believe individual lives mattered more than strategy. Okay, but this changes everything. If we move on the basement, if we expose what's there, he'll know we have inside information. He'll know someone betrayed him. Let him know. Let him understand that his own son chose strangers over blood. Maybe that's the only thing that will actually hurt him. He smiled then, sharp and dangerous and full of something that looked like pride. You're braver than you think you are, Elena Cross. No, I'm just tired of being afraid. We worked through the night, building a plan that felt equal parts desperation and hope. And somewhere around 4 a.m. I realized I was no longer wondering if we'd survive this. I was wondering who we'd be when it was over, if we'd still recognize ourselves after we'd burned down Vincent Moretti's empire and risen from the ashes it left behind. I couldn't stop thinking about that basement. The image haunted me. That steel door with its fresh scratches, the clinical precision of the video, the name Elijah Carver hanging in the air like an accusation I hadn't yet answered. My memories of the estate had been carefully curated. A tour of only what Vincent wanted me to see. The sun-filled rooms where I'd administered medications, the library with its leather-bound books, the garden where roses bloomed despite the season. But underneath all that manufactured elegance, there had been something else breathing, something dark and patient, waiting. Saturday morning, I stood in Dante's kitchen making coffee I didn't want, staring at the espresso machine like it held answers instead of just expensive Italian engineering. He found me there, already dressed in dark clothes that made him look less like a CEO and more like what he actually was. A man preparing for war against his own blood. We have to go back. I said it without preamble, without cushioning the demand with reason or strategy. His expression didn't change, but I saw the tension ripple through his shoulders, the way his hands tightened around the folder he was carrying. Too dangerous, too rushed. If we move now, we tip him off before we have enough evidence to make charges stick. If we wait, Elijah Carver becomes another name in your files. Another person we could have saved but didn't because we were being strategic. The words landed between us like stones, and I watched him absorb the impact, the guilt that had been calcifying in him for years, recognizing its reflection in my urgency. He set down the folder with careful precision, and I realized he'd already been considering it, had probably been awake all night, weighing impossible calculations. If we do this, if we go back to the estate, you need to understand what you're risking. He'll know. My father will know you've turned against him, and everything that comes after, every threat, every retaliation, that's on both of us. I know. Do you? Because once we cross this line, Elena, there's no version of this story where you get to be invisible again. You'll be a witness, a target, someone whose name gets whispered in rooms you'll never enter, marked in ledgers you'll never see. I moved closer to him, close enough to see the shadows under his eyes, the evidence of his own sleepless night. Close enough to realize that somewhere between the garden and this kitchen, between being saved and choosing to fight, I'd started to care about him in ways that complicated everything. Then teach me how to survive it. But don't ask me to walk away from someone I can still help. That's not who I am. And I don't think it's who you are either, no matter how hard you've tried to become your father's son to destroy him. Something cracked in his expression. Surprise. Maybe respect. The recognition that I'd just named the thing he'd never said out loud. The fundamental paradox of spending a decade learning to think like a monster so you could dismantle one. Okay, but we do this my way. Carefully. You go back as his nurse, collecting items you forgot. My people create a distraction, fire marshal inspection, something that requires his attention upstairs. You have 15 minutes maximum to document whatever's in that basement. And if I find someone there, if Elijah Carver is all ready, then we call it in anonymously and get you out. But Elena, if the basement is occupied, if there's an active victim, we can't extract them without exposing our involvement. The best we can do is trigger a rescue through official channels. It wasn't enough. Wasn't justice. Wasn't salvation. Just the ugly mathematics of survival, where sometimes the best option was still terrible. But I nodded, accepting the constraints of reality, understanding that heroes in movies got to save everyone while people in real life had to make choices that left scars. The plan was surgical. I returned to the estate Sunday afternoon, playing the role of the apologetic employee who'd left in a panic after a family emergency. Vincent received me in the library, looking frail again, the performance calibrated perfectly to his audience. His smile was warm, his concern for my mother genuine-sounding, his forgiveness magnanimous. Of course you had to go to her, dear. Family comes first. Always. I trust she's receiving adequate care. Yes, thank you for understanding. We take care of our own, Elena. Remember that. The emphasis on our own felt like ownership disguised as inclusion, and I manufactured a grateful smile while my skin crawled with revulsion. He asked me to stay for tea, to tell him about my mother's condition, and I performed gratitude while counting minutes until the fire marshal arrived, until the distraction gave me access to the one room I'd been forbidden to see. The inspection began at 3 p.m. Dante's people were punctual and professional, carrying clipboards and wearing official-looking badges that would hold up to casual scrutiny if not detailed investigation. Vincent was required to accompany them through the upper floors, his presence necessary to open locked rooms and answer questions about electrical systems and emergency exits. I waited until their voices faded toward the third floor, then moved. The basement stairs were exactly where the blueprints had indicated, hidden behind a door in the kitchen pantry that I'd assumed led to storage. The descent felt like traveling backward through time, the polished elegance of the main house giving way to concrete and fluorescent lights, beauty stripped away to reveal the infrastructure underneath. My hands shook as I reached the steel door from the video-y, as I tested the handle and found it unlocked, as I pushed it open and understood that some thresholds change you just by crossing them. The room beyond wasn't a prison. Not currently. It was an archive, filing cabinets lining the walls, a desk with a computer terminal, everything meticulously organized. I started photographing immediately, hands steadier than my breathing, documenting drawer after drawer of files that dated back decades. Names, photographs, women's faces staring out from intake forms, their expressions ranging from terrified to resigned to already broken. And then I found the folder marked 1998, and my mother's face looked back at me from a Polaroid I'd never seen her pose for. The world tilted. My vision narrowed to that photograph. Her younger face, her nurse's uniform, the fear in her eyes that I recognized because I'd seen it in my own mirror every day before I'd learned to hide it. The accompanying report detailed everything in clinical language: her recruitment, her captivity, her eventual release conditional upon continued cooperation and silence. She'd been 23, my age, a nursing student, my path. Vincent hadn't chosen me randomly. He'd chosen me because I was her inheritance, because breaking me was a way of proving that his reach was generational, that escape was always temporary, that eventually everyone came back to their designated place in his design. I photographed everything with hands that had gone numb, my mind fragmenting around this impossible truth. 25 years. She'd carried this for 25 years, had raised me in the shadow of trauma she'd never named, had probably seen Vincent's face every time she looked at me and been reminded of what she'd survived, what she'd been made complicit in through silence. I barely made it back upstairs before the nausea hit. Found myself in the garden, the same garden where Dante's mother had died, where roses bloomed with roots that probably touched old secrets, doubled over and trying to breathe through revelation. Dante found me there an hour later, after the fire marshal had left, after I'd cleaned myself up enough to look functional instead of shattered. One glance at the documents clutched in my hands and his face went blank with understanding. Elena. Just my name. But the way he said it carried weight, apology and recognition, and shared rage at a man who'd turned human lives into experiments in control. She never told me. 25 years. And she never said a word. That's how he works. He makes victims feel complicit, convinces them they chose it somehow, that speaking up would only confirm their guilt. It's not silence. It's survival. We drove back to his apartment in heavy quiet, the evidence between us like a third passenger. That night, I finally broke. Not crying exactly. Something deeper than tears. The kind of grief that rewrites your origin story. Dante sat beside me on the floor of his too-perfect living room, not touching, not offering empty comfort. Just present while I deconstructed and tried to reassemble a version of myself that could contain this new understanding. He made her believe she was complicit, that if she ever spoke, she'd be prosecuted too. That's the genius of it. He doesn't just break people. He makes them accomplices to their own destruction. My phone buzzed then, cutting through the darkness. A message from the unknown number, sent to my new device that only Dante knew existed. The video downloaded automatically, security overridden by someone with resources that rivaled our own. The footage showed my mother in her hospital bed, not Lexington, but earlier, from Cambridge Memorial. Audio overlaid the image, spliced and edited. My voice discussing Vincent's operation, Dante's name, words I'd said taken out of context and rearranged to sound like confession instead of conversation. The editing was sophisticated, nearly seamless. Without the originals, without proof of manipulation, it sounded exactly like I was admitting to crimes I'd never committed, describing involvement I'd never had. The final frame was text, cold and precise. Tell Dante to stand down, or we release this to the FBI. You have 48 hours. I sat there holding my phone, staring at evidence of how easily truth could be manufactured, how testimony could be weaponized, how Vincent had anticipated every move and prepared countermeasures that would destroy us before we could touch him. He knew. From the beginning, he knew I'd turn against him. Dante took the phone, watched the video with an expression that had gone beyond anger into something colder, more calculated. When he finally spoke, his voice carried absolute certainty. This doesn't change anything. It accelerates everything. But it doesn't change the fundamental equation. We have Monday to extract Elijah Carver and secure enough evidence to make charges stick before they can deploy this 48 hours. And if we fail, then we both go down. But at least we'll go down fighting. He reached over then, his hand finding mine in the darkness. And I realized that somewhere between the garden and the basement, between witnessing his brutality and his guilt, I'd fallen for someone who terrified and steadied me in equal measure. The feeling was inconvenient and probably stupid and absolutely inescapable. I'm afraid, I admitted quietly. Good. Fear means you understand the stakes. But Elena, don't let it make you hesitate. Tomorrow, we move. And when we do, I need you to be exactly who you were in that basement. Brave enough to document hell even while you're standing in it. I nodded, squeezing his hand, feeling the calluses from violence and the steadiness of someone who'd spent a decade preparing for this exact moment. Outside, Boston glittered with ordinary lights, people living ordinary lives, untouched by basements and blackmail, by fathers who turned love into warfare. But I wasn't ordinary anymore. I was a weapon Vincent Moretti had tried to forge, and I was about to be used against him in ways he'd never anticipated. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it felt like the first true choice I'd made in my entire life. Dante didn't stand down. I watched him transform in the 12 hours after we received that video. Watched the last remnants of the man who'd walked into Lucia's diner with blood on his jaw dissolve into something harder, something that had been waiting underneath all along. He made calls and clipped sentences that sounded like battle commands. He reviewed files with the kind of focus that excluded everything else: food, sleep, the basic human maintenance that keeps people tethered to their bodies. I brought him coffee he didn't drink and watched him orchestrate war against his own father with the precision of someone who'd been rehearsing this moment his entire adult life. By Monday morning, he'd traced the blackmail video to its source. Marcus Chen, Vincent's oldest lieutenant, operating out of a consulting firm in Chinatown that laundered money through real estate deals and immigration services. Marcus had been with Vincent for 30 years, had probably witnessed every crime, every broken woman, every calculated cruelty. He was complicit in ways that made him untouchable, too embedded, too knowledgeable, protected by mutually assured destruction. Dante dismantled him in 6 hours. I watched it happen from his surveillance room, a space I hadn't known existed until he'd led me there Sunday night, monitors covering an entire wall, feeds from locations across Boston, the technological infrastructure of someone who'd spent a decade preparing for exactly this kind of siege. The footage showed Marcus being approached outside his office by men in suits who looked like lawyers but moved like soldiers. No violence, no threats. Just a folder handed over with surgical efficiency, Marcus's face draining of color as he flipped through pages that apparently contained the architecture of his own destruction. "Bank records," Dante explained, his voice flat and clinical. "Proof he's been embezzling from my father for 8 years. Offshore accounts in the Caymans, property in Vancouver under his daughter's name, a paper trail that violates every rule Vincent has about loyalty and theft. You're blackmailing him. I'm providing him with clarity about his options. He can give us everything: the operation structure, current victims, delivery routes, Vincent's protection network and law enforcement, or I send this to my father and let nature take its course." I thought about Marcus's daughter, about the property in Vancouver that probably represented his attempt at building something clean for her, something untouched by the empire he'd helped construct. I thought about how Dante had found that vulnerability and weaponized it the same way Vincent had weaponized my mother's illness, my nursing school debt, every soft place that made me human. Is this who you are? Or who you had to become? The question came out quieter than I'd intended, stripped of judgment but full of genuine need to understand. Dante didn't look away from the monitors, but I saw his jaw tighten, saw the way his hands gripped the edge of the desk like he was physically holding himself together. Does it matter? Yes, it matters to me. He finally turned then, and I saw exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that comes from carrying contradictions too heavy for one person to bear. The son who loved his father and the man who had to destroy him. The protector who used the same tools as predators. The human being who'd learned to think like a monster and couldn't quite remember how to think any other way. I don't know anymore, Elena. I've spent so long learning his language, operating by his rules, that sometimes I can't tell where the strategy ends and I begin. All I know is that if this is what it takes to stop him, I'll do it. And I'll live with whatever that makes me. Marcus broke before lunch. The footage showed him in an undisclosed location, probably one of Dante's warehouses, neutral territory that existed outside Vincent's influence, giving a confession that detailed 40 years of organized crime with the mechanical precision of someone who'd stopped believing in redemption and settled for survival. Names, dates, the hierarchical structure of Vincent's network, current operations, including Elijah Carver's scheduled arrival that evening. Dante handed everything to Elena Vasquez, the FBI agent he'd been cultivating for 3 years, someone who'd lost her younger sister to trafficking when they were teenagers, whose entire career had been shaped by that loss, who wanted Vincent Moretti destroyed almost as much as Dante did. I watched them coordinate over encrypted channels, watched a federal task force mobilize based on intelligence that had cost Dante a decade to accumulate, and Marcus his entire sense of self to deliver. The raids began at 6 p.m., simultaneous hits on 12 locations across 3 states. I sat in Dante's surveillance room watching feeds from news helicopters, from body cameras on federal agents, from his own network of observers stationed at each site. The ballet of law enforcement descending on Vincent's empire should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like watching a play where everyone knew their lines, but the stage kept shifting, because every location was clean. The basement we documented, sanitized, no evidence, walls freshly painted. The warehouse Marcus had identified as a holding facility, empty except for legitimate inventory and paperwork. The consulting firm where women had allegedly been processed, normal office space, employment records that showed nothing irregular. Every site had been scrubbed with such thoroughness that forensics teams found nothing beyond standard commercial activity. Someone had warned them. Someone inside Dante's carefully constructed operation had been feeding information to Vincent, giving him time to erase 40 years of crimes before the FBI could document them. The news that night rewrote the narrative with devastating efficiency. Federal raids on Moretti properties, Yield no evidence. Anonymous tips appear to be false claims. FBI investigating possible vendetta by estranged family member Dante Moretti, who allegedly fabricated allegations to seize control of legitimate business empire. I watched Dante's face as the story unfolded, as years of meticulous planning evaporated into public humiliation and implied criminality. His expression remained controlled, but I could see the fractures forming underneath, the realization that his father had outmaneuvered him, had anticipated every move and prepared countermeasures that turned the hunter into the hunted. He knew. The whole time, he knew what we were planning. Dante's voice was quiet, almost wondering, like he was impressed despite himself by the scope of his father's intelligence network. Marcus's confession? Probably coerced. Or he was a double agent from the beginning. Either way, we just gave Vincent everything he needed to paint me as an unstable son trying to destroy his family for personal gain. The implications crystallized slowly, weight accumulating like snow before an avalanche. The FBI would investigate Dante now. His finances, his associates, his decade of careful preparation would all be scrutinized as evidence of conspiracy rather than justice. And me, the nurse who'd appeared in his life at a convenient moment, who'd provided testimony about crimes no one could verify. I'd be examined as either an accomplice or a dupe. My credibility destroyed before I could ever testify to anything that mattered. The documents I photographed, my mother's file, that's still real. Without corroborating physical evidence, it's just paper. He'll claim it's fabricated, part of my elaborate scheme. And Elena, you're the only witness to those files existing in his basement. Your word against his, and he's a respected businessman while you're a desperate girl with debts who took money from his son. I know how it looks. I stood there in his surveillance room, surrounded by monitors showing empty warehouses and federal agents packing up equipment. And I understood with perfect clarity that we'd lost. Not because we'd been wrong, but because Vincent Moretti had spent 40 years building an empire that could withstand truth, that could outlast evidence, that could transform victims into accomplices and justice into vendetta. Dante moved to stand beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat of him, the solid presence of someone who'd just watched his life's work collapse but was still standing. You can walk away. Right now. New identity, new life, your mother protected. I have resources that exist outside Vincent's reach. I can get you somewhere safe. And you? I'll face whatever comes. The investigation, the criminal charges, if they file them. I knew the risks when I started this. So it's over. We just let him win? He turned to face me fully then, and I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not defeat exactly, but a kind of terrible clarity. The recognition that some wars don't end with victory, just with choices about how you want to lose. There's one other option. You testify anyway. Tell your story publicly, documented and recorded. You won't have physical evidence, but you'll have your voice. Your testimony. It won't be enough to convict him criminally, but it might be enough to destroy him socially, economically. Make him toxic to the politicians and businessmen who've enabled him. Turn him into a liability instead of an asset. And what happens to me? You become the center of the story. Every journalist, every conspiracy theorist, every person with an agenda will examine your life looking for proof you're lying. You'll never be anonymous again. Never safe in the way safety means invisibility. Your face will be on the news. Your past will be dissected, and Vincent will spend whatever resources he has left trying to discredit you, destroy you, make you wish you'd chosen silence. He stepped closer, his hand coming up to cup my face with a gentleness that felt absurd given everything we'd just lost, everything we were about to face. But Elena, if you do this, if you stand up and tell the truth even knowing it won't be enough for justice, you'll break something in him that 40 years of silence protected. You'll prove that victims can become witnesses. That escape is possible, that his power has limits. I thought about my mother's photograph, her young face frozen in that moment of terror. I thought about all the women in those files, the ones who'd survived by forgetting, by rewriting their stories until the trauma became something they'd chosen. I thought about Elijah Carver, whoever he was, probably already relocated to another location we'd never find. And I thought about the girl I'd been 6 days ago, the one who kept her head down and made herself small, who believed survival meant disappearing. I'll do it. I'll testify. Dante's expression cracked then, relief and anguish mixing with something that looked dangerously close to love, and he kissed me with an urgency that felt like goodbye and hello colliding, like we were acknowledging that whatever came next would either destroy us or forge us into something neither of us recognized. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, his breath unsteady, then we do this together. And Elena, no matter what happens, no matter how bad it gets, remember that you chose this. Not because you were manipulated or coerced, but because you decided some things matter more than safety. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Dante's buzzed simultaneously. We pulled them out with hands that had learned to expect catastrophe, and the message was identical on both screens. A photograph of Vincent in his library, looking directly at the camera with a smile that promised nothing good. The caption appeared below. "Congratulations on your engagement. I've taken the liberty of scheduling a family dinner to celebrate. Tomorrow at 8 p.m. Both of you. Non-negotiable. After all, we have so much to discuss about your future together." I stared at the screen, at the implication that Vincent had been monitoring everything, our messages, our location, possibly even the conversations we'd thought were private. And the word engagement hung there like a threat disguised as blessing, suggesting he knew about the kiss, about the feelings neither of us had named, about the fact that somewhere between destruction and defiance, we'd become something more complicated than allies. "He's going to kill us," I said quietly. "Probably. But he's going to have to look us in the eye while he does it. And maybe that's worth something." I didn't tell Dante what I was planning. Some decisions require solitude, not because you doubt your resolve, but because explaining them means inviting someone else's fear to complicate your own. He'd spent the night strategizing for Vincent's dinner, building contingency plans and exit routes, preparing for confrontation the way generals prepare for battle. But I'd learned something in that basement, staring at my mother's photograph. Wars aren't always won by the people with the best strategies. Sometimes they're won by the ones willing to break the rules everyone else considers sacred. Tuesday morning, I waited until Dante left for a meeting with his lawyers, men in expensive suits who specialized in defending the indefensible, who'd pivot from helping him dismantle his father's empire to protecting him from criminal conspiracy charges without missing a breath. The moment his car disappeared into Boston traffic, I disabled his apartment's security system using the override code I'd memorized from watching him enter it dozens of times. He'd taught me more than he realized during our brief alliance, not just about Vincent's operation, but about how power actually functioned, about the difference between being protected and being prepared. I took the documents, copies I'd made without telling him, insurance I'd kept hidden in my room because some part of me had always known we'd need leverage he didn't control, evidence that existed outside his carefully orchestrated plans. Then I went to see the one person who could force this into daylight without depending on FBI cooperation or media narratives or the legal system Vincent had spent 40 years corrupting. Catherine Moretti lived in a Back Bay brownstone that felt like a museum of rebellion. Walls covered in newspaper clippings documenting her brother's suspected crimes, shelves lined with legal textbooks and activist manifestos, rescued cats weaving between furniture that had probably cost a fortune 40 years ago and hadn't been replaced since. She opened the door wearing reading glasses and an expression that suggested she'd been expecting me, or someone like me, for longer than I'd been alive. "You're the nurse. The one Vincent chose to test Dante." Not a question. She gestured me inside with the casual authority of someone who'd walked away from empire and learned to build power from different materials. Knowledge, patience, the particular strength that comes from refusing to participate in your family's sins. "I need your help, obviously. People don't come to me unless they're desperate or suicidal. Usually both." She made tea in a kitchen that smelled like cat food and old books. And I explained everything while she listened with the focused attention of someone who'd spent decades waiting for this exact conversation. When I showed her the documents, my mother's file, the evidence of Vincent's 40-year operation, her hands trembled slightly as she turned pages, but her expression remained controlled. I left when I discovered what he was building. I was 25, engaged to a good man who wanted nothing to do with my family's money. Vincent tried to stop me. When threats didn't work, he had my fiancé beaten so badly he needed reconstructive surgery. Then he told me I could stay and watch it happen again, or leave and never speak of it. So I left. She set down the file with careful precision, removed her glasses to reveal eyes that matched Dante's. Same gray, same winter sky coldness, Same capacity for calculated fury. I've spent 30 years documenting his crimes from the outside, collecting evidence that would never hold up in court but might matter in the court of public opinion. You coming here with internal files? That changes the equation. But Elena, you need to understand what you're actually proposing. Going public means sacrificing any chance at a normal life. You'll be dissected, investigated, turned into a symbol whether you want to be or not. I know. I'm doing it anyway. Why? And don't tell me it's about justice. Justice is abstract. This is personal. I thought about how to explain it. The weight of carrying my mother's silence. The rage that had been building since I'd found her photograph. The understanding that some cages are inherited and the only way to break them is to burn down the architecture entirely, because he made her feel complicit. Made her believe that surviving meant she'd somehow chosen it, that speaking up would only prove her guilt. And I refused to pass that silence to another generation. I refused to let him win by making us ashamed of what was done to us. Catherine smiled then, sharp and approving, the expression of someone recognizing a kindred refusal to accept defeat disguised as pragmatism. Then we'll need to be strategic. Vincent has judges, police, federal agents on his payroll. Anything we bring forward through official channels gets buried. But he also has vulnerabilities. His reputation in legitimate business circles. His relationships with politicians who can't afford to be associated with scandal. We hit him there, make him toxic. Make protecting him cost more than abandoning him. How? There's a sub-level beneath the basement. That's where he keeps the real records. Financial ledgers that document payoffs, blackmail material on every official he owns, offshore account numbers that trace the money. The files you found are evidence of crimes. What's in the vault is evidence of conspiracy that reaches into every level of Boston's power structure. Get me access to that, and I can destroy him in ways that don't require a conviction. My blood went cold. The sublevel. Of course there was a sublevel. Vincent's paranoia wouldn't allow his most damaging secrets to exist anywhere accessible, anywhere vulnerable to the kind of raid we'd just witnessed fail. How do I get in? Biometric lock. Requires his fingerprint and a code that only he knows. But Elena, tonight's dinner, that's not a social occasion. He's planning something. Testing something. If you can get him to take you to the sublevel, if you can convince him you're exactly what he's been shaping you to become, he might give you access. Abusers love showing off their power. It's how they maintain control. She spent the next 3 hours teaching me how to survive what was coming, how to wear compliance-like armor, how to make Vincent believe he'd won, how to document everything without appearing to notice I was documenting. She gave me a recording device disguised as a necklace, a tiny camera hidden in my watchie, equipment that felt like artifacts from a different kind of war. One more thing. If Dante knew you were here, he'd stop you. He loves you, you know. In whatever broken way he's capable of loving anyone after what Vincent did to him. So you need to decide, are you doing this with him, or in spite of him? I don't know anymore. Maybe both. I returned to the apartment at 4 p.m. Dante was already there, dressed for dinner in a suit that probably cost more than my car had, his expression carefully neutral when he saw me walk in. Where were you? Walking. Thinking. Preparing. He studied me for a long moment, and I wondered if he could see the deception, if 10 years of learning to read people for survival had taught him to recognize when someone he cared about was lying. But he just nodded, accepted my explanation the way you accept things when pushing harder means acknowledging truths you're not ready to face. Elena. Tonight, whatever he says, whatever he offers or threatens, I need you to follow my lead. Let me handle him. Okay. The lie tasted like ash, but I smiled and let him believe I'd be the protected one tonight, the witness who needed managing instead of the woman who'd already decided to become something more dangerous. We arrived at the estate at 7:55 p.m. Dante's paranoia about punctuality expressed through arriving early enough to demonstrate respect, but not so early as to seem eager. Vincent greeted us at the door himself, looking more vital than I'd ever seen him during my nursing shifts. No tremor in his hands, no weakness in his posture. The stroke victim had been a performance, and we'd all played our parts perfectly. My children. How wonderful to have family together again. He embraced Dante first, brief and formal, the kind of contact that communicated obligation rather than affection. Then he turned to me, and his hands cupped my face with a tenderness that made my skin crawl. Elena, you've caused quite a stir, haven't you? Turning my son against me, making him believe in fairy tales about justice and redemption. It's almost charming how naive you both are. Dinner was theater, expensive courses served by staff who moved like ghosts, wines that probably cost more than my annual rent, conversation that danced around everything that mattered while pretending to discuss nothing consequential. Vincent talked about business acquisitions and political developments, about the raid's aftermath and how his lawyers had already begun filing defamation suits against the FBI agents involved. He was relaxed, confident, a man who'd won and wanted us to acknowledge his victory. Halfway through dessert, he set down his fork and looked at us with an expression I couldn't parse, something between affection and contempt, pride and disgust. I have something to show you both. A gift. Really. Documentation of exactly how my empire has functioned for 40 years. Every name, every transaction, every piece of leverage, the complete architecture of everything you've tried to destroy. Dante's jaw tightened. Why would you show us that? Because I want you to understand the futility of resistance. Because watching you realize that even with perfect evidence you can't touch me, that's more satisfying than simply eliminating you. And because Elena deserves to see what real power looks like before she makes her final choice. He stood, gestured for us to follow. We descended through the basement I'd already violated, past the steel door I'd documented, to a hidden panel I'd never noticed. The sublevel opened like a mouth, concrete stairs leading into fluorescent-lit certainty, into the heart of everything Vincent had built on the bones of broken women. The vault was exactly what Catherine had described. Filing cabinets and a computer terminal, ledgers documenting 40 years of systematic corruption. Vincent moved through the space with proprietary comfort, pulling files and explaining their contents with the pride of a curator discussing his collection. This is Senator Morrison's file. Photographs of him with an underage intern. This is Judge Chen. Gambling debts in Atlantic City that would destroy his career. Chief of Police Davidson. Payments for looking the other way during certain operations. Everyone who matters, everyone with power, documented and controlled. I touched the necklace at my throat. Catherine's recording device capturing every word, every admission, every name that would burn Boston's power structure to ash if it ever reached the right journalists. Vincent noticed the gesture, smiled like he'd expected it. Recording me, Elena? How thorough. But you still don't understand. These people don't protect me because I blackmail them. They protect me because I've made myself essential. Destroy me, and you destroy the infrastructure that keeps this city functional. I'm not a criminal. I'm the cost of doing business. He turned to Dante then, and something dangerous flickered in his expression. She's stronger than your mother was. I'll give her that. Your mother tried to leave too, tried to take you away from me. So I showed her exactly what would happen if she succeeded. Had her brother beaten, her sister's business burned, every person she loved touched by consequences. And when she finally understood that escape meant watching everyone she cared about suffer, she chose the only option I'd left her. At least Elena seems prepared to pay the price herself instead of forcing others to die for her convictions. The room tilted. Dante had gone absolutely still, his face drained of color, and I understood that we'd just been handed confirmation of what he'd spent 20 years suspecting, that his mother hadn't died from an aneurysm, that Vincent had killed her by making her choose between living in a cage and watching everyone she loved get destroyed. That suicide had been the only form of resistance she'd had left. You killed her. Dante's voice was quiet, almost wondering, stripped of everything except grief that had been waiting decades to be acknowledged. I gave her a choice. She made it, just like you'll make yours. Stand with me. Accept your inheritance. Learn to wield power instead of fetishizing morality. Or watch Elena become another name in my files, another woman who thought courage was enough to survive men like us. I looked at Dante, saw him fracturing under the weight of confirmation, and I made my decision. Not the one Vincent expected. Not the one Dante would have chosen for me. The one I'd been building toward since I'd opened that envelope and found my mother's photograph. I choose to fight. I pulled my phone from my clutch, hit send on the email I'd prepared before we'd arrived. All of Catherine's documentation, all of my photographs, all of Marcus's coerced testimony, sent simultaneously to 20 journalists, 3 civil rights organizations, and every politician's opponent in the upcoming election. The message was simple. Vincent Moretti's empire, documented and exposed, with enough evidence to start investigations that wouldn't stop even if we didn't survive the night. Vincent's expression didn't change, but something in the air shifted. The recognition that I'd just burned down his carefully constructed infrastructure of silence. That whatever happened next, he'd lost control of the narrative. Foolish girl. You've just signed your own death warrant. Maybe. But I've also made killing me irrelevant. The information is already out there. I'm just a witness now. A symbol. Kill me, and you make martyrdom. Let me live, and you make me a constant reminder that your power has limits. Dante moved then, positioning himself between me and his father. And I saw decades of conflict crystallize into this single moment. The boy who'd loved an impossible man forced to become the man who'd destroy him. You don't touch her. You don't touch anyone ever again. Whatever comes next, whatever investigation or trial or reckoning, we face it knowing we tried. That's more than you can say. Vincent laughed, genuinely amused, as if we'd entertained him with our theatrical gesture of defiance. We'll see. We'll see how you feel when the consequences start cascading. When everyone you've tried to protect becomes collateral damage. When you realize that truth without power is just noise that gets drowned out by the machinery of reality. But as we left the vault, climbing back toward something that might have been freedom, or might have been just another cage with wider bars, I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope. Not the naive kind that believes justice prevails. The harder kind that acknowledges you might lose but chooses to fight anyway. That transforms victims into witnesses, that turns silence into testimony. Outside, police sirens wailed in the distance, Catherine's contacts moving faster than Vincent had anticipated, and somewhere in the night, my mother was safe. The documents were spreading through networks he couldn't control, and I was finally, terribly, free of the belief that survival required disappearing. I'd chosen to be seen. Now we'd find out what that cost. Vincent Moretti was arrested at 11 p.m. that night, federal agents flooding the estate with warrants that had been expedited through channels even his corrupted network couldn't block. I watched it happen from Dante's car, parked 3 blocks away, the flashing lights painting the Gothic mansion in alternating colors, red and blue, justice and consequence. Dante's hands gripped the steering wheel with enough force to turn his knuckles white, his entire body rigid with something between vindication and grief. He'll fight this for years. His voice was hollow, already anticipating the long war ahead. But I'd learned something in that vault, watching Vincent explain his empire with casual pride. Monsters don't fear battles. They fear being seen, being named, having their facades stripped away until everyone understands exactly what they've always been. Let him fight. The documentation is public now. Even if he beats some charges, he'll never be legitimate again. You didn't just want to put him in prison, Dante. You wanted to destroy what he'd built. We did that tonight. He turned to look at me then, and I saw tears tracking down his face, the first time I'd witnessed him cry, the first crack in the marble composure that had defined him. Not sadness exactly, something more complicated. Release, maybe. Or the terrible relief of finally letting yourself feel what you've been holding at bay for 20 years. I reached over, pulled him toward me in the confined space, and let him break against my shoulder while sirens wailed and an empire collapsed 3 blocks away. The trial became the media event Vincent had probably anticipated but underestimated. 47 counts. I testified for 3 days. Cameras outside the courthouse. My face on every news channel. They dissected my background, my unpaid loans, my mother's illness, the desperation that had made me vulnerable. But they also found dozens of women who'd seen my testimony and recognized their own stories in mine, who came forward with proof that escape had seemed impossible until someone else proved it wasn't. Dante testified on the 5th day, faced his father across a courtroom and dismantled 40 years of lies with clinical precision. Vincent didn't look at him once, not when his son explained how women had been recruited, not when he detailed the vault's contents, not even when Dante's voice finally cracked describing his mother's death. That severed thread felt more final than any verdict. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all 47 counts. Life without possibility of parole. 6 months later, I stood in the doorway of something I'd helped build, a community health clinic in Dorchester, my name on a modest plaque outside. We offered primary care, mental health services, legal advocacy, everything I'd wished had existed when I was 23 and desperate. My mother worked reception 3 days a week, her hands steady now, her smile genuine in ways I hadn't seen since childhood. "I'm sorry I taught you to be invisible," she'd said one night. "I thought I was protecting you. I didn't realize I was just passing on his cage. You did what you had to do to survive. But you taught me we can do more than survive. We can actually live." I'd finished my nursing degree that spring. Dante had quietly paid off my loans, and after arguing for 2 weeks, I'd accepted it as a gift rather than obligation. My diploma hung in my office next to photographs of women we'd helped, evidence that the work mattered. Dante had walked away from the Moretti empire, transferred every legitimate business to management teams, liquidated what couldn't be reformed. He'd started teaching at Northeastern that fall, criminal justice and ethics, using his insider knowledge to educate the next generation. The Boston Globe had run a profile with the headline, "Reformed Mob Heir Teaches Ethics at NU," and he'd found a way to laugh about it. We still saw each other, though not with the intensity of those weeks when survival required constant proximity. We both needed space to figure out who we were when crisis wasn't forcing us together. We had coffee dates and long conversations about nothing consequential, learning to build connection on foundations other than shared trauma. One evening in late November, standing on his apartment balcony watching the city transition from day to night, I asked the question I'd been holding since the verdict. "Do you regret it? Everything you gave up to destroy him?" He considered this seriously, his profile outlined against the skyline. "I regret what I had to become to do it. The years I spent learning to think like him. The people I hurt because I'd convinced myself the ends justified the means. But the outcome? No, I don't regret that. And I don't regret you." He pulled me closer, his arms settling around my shoulders with easy familiarity. Below us, Boston hummed with ordinary life, people going home, lights turning on in windows, the small sacred rhythms of safety. "Your father said you'd never escape what he made you." "I know, but he was wrong. I didn't escape it. I chose something different. That's not the same as running. It's freedom to decide what the past means, how much power it gets to have over who I become." I turned in his arms, looking up at this man who'd kicked down a door to save me and then spent months learning he didn't need to keep saving me, that we could save ourselves together. I'm not who I was in that basement. Neither am I. That's the best kind of freedom, not erasing what happened, but proving it doesn't get to write the ending. He kissed me then, slow and deliberate, not about urgency or desperation, but about choice. About two people who'd survived hell separately and decided they might build something beautiful together. The city lights spread out below us like possibilities. I'd spent so long learning to be invisible, then being forced into visibility on terms I didn't choose. Now, finally, I was learning something else. How to exist in my own life without hiding or performing, without waiting for the next cage to close. "What are you thinking?" Dante asked softly. "That I'm not defined by what was done to me. That surviving isn't the same as living, but living is possible even after survival felt impossible. That we get to write what comes next. And that's the most terrifying and beautiful kind of freedom." He smiled then, genuine and unguarded. The boy who'd loved his mother and the man who'd avenged her, finally learning he could exist between those extremes. The work would never be finished. Vincent's imprisonment didn't erase the systems that had enabled him, didn't magically heal everyone he'd broken. But we'd created cracks in those systems. We'd proved escape was possible. We'd transformed silence into testimony, isolation into community. Dante's arms tightened around me, and I leaned into him, both of us looking out at the city that had nearly destroyed us and had somehow become the place where we'd learned to live instead of just survive. The basement door was demolished, but I remained. Transformed, scarred, whole in ways that had nothing to do with being unbroken and everything to do with choosing to keep building even after destruction, to keep loving even after loss, to keep fighting even when surrender seemed smarter. The wind shifted, carrying the salt smell of the harbor. I closed my eyes, feeling the moment settle into memory, the warmth of Dante's arms, the city lights, the profound relief of finally being free to exist without apology, without performance, without the constant calculation of survival. That was enough. That was everything. That was the beginning of whatever came next. If you made it to the end of this story, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. And click the yellow bell to subscribe to the channel and support us. Keep the adventure going by clicking on the suggested video on your screen.